Imagine you're a soldier in the American Revolutionary War 250 years ago, and you're given your daily ration of 1 pound of bony meat. What are you going to do? Soldiers in that time period lived in very, very primitive conditions. They had trouble procuring enough blankets, enough clothing, enough cooking equipment, even utensils. There were even times it was difficult to have enough fire to cook their meager provisions. They had a lack of firewood. They even had difficulty in starting their fires when they had rainy conditions. With all these challenges, cooking on the march or even in camp was extremely difficult. They had to deal with the lack of provision and the inability to cook it. When these soldiers signed up, they were promised rations of a pound of meat a day and a pound of bread a day. This rarely happened in this full completeness. This pound of meat ration might come in a couple of different forms if they're going to get it, and that is, it might be a salt provision like salt beef or salt pork, but more likely they were given a fresh provision, something that was probably butchered that day or the day before. Now, most of these cuts are probably very difficult to cook cuts. They're just cutting up the entire cow and dividing it between all the men that are available. So a lot of times the men will get something like a leg cut, which is very difficult to cook. I am sure that the people in charge of the war had every intention of delivering all these articles to the soldiers. They wanted to give them their best, but sometimes it just wasn't available. Joseph Plum Martin in the early 19th century writes a memoir about his experiences as a Revolutionary War soldier. And he does a great job of explaining the everyday life of the soldier. Not very much about battles and what the fighting was like, but what life was like. Here's his description of what they were given as soldiers. He says, "When we engaged in the service, we were promised the following articles for a ration: 1 pound of good and wholesome fresh or salt beef, or 3/4 of a pound of good salt pork, a pound of good flour, salt or hard bread, a quart of salt to every 100 pounds of fresh beef, a quart of vinegar to every 100 rations, a gill of rum, brandy or whiskey per day, some little soap or candles. I have forgotten how much, for I had so little of these 2 articles that I never knew the quantity. And as to the article of vinegar, I don't recall ever having any except for a spoonful at that famous rice and vinegar Thanksgiving in Pennsylvania. But we never received what was allowed us. Oftentimes I have gone 1, 2, 3, or 4 days without a morsel, unless the fields or forest might afford a chance enough to prevent our absolute starvation." In another part of his memoir, he describes the lack of equipment, the fact that sometimes they ate their provisions raw because they had no other way to cook them, or they were too tired to do any cooking. But he goes on to say that most of the time these fresh beef rations were just cooked on a stick right over the fire. We're going to try our simple ration 3 different ways. The first way is just simply over the fire. I have this wonderful little wire fork, which is very commonly found in the archaeological digs in Revolutionary War sites. So we're going to use this little wire fork and cook it over the fire. We might think this is actually the most desirable way to cook for us personally. This is basically like, putting meat on a barbecue grill. But of course, remember, the soldiers have to eat this day in, day out. And of course, they're not using the best cut of meat ever. Our simple meat on the stick, probably the most common and most popular way for the soldiers to cook their meat ration. It's going to be chewy depending on the cut you've got. And this one definitely is. But it's got some good flavor. There's certainly the question of what is the most nutritious way, or what way could we get the most energy out of our meat ration? And the officers of the day certainly thought that cooking your meat on a stick or frying it wasn't the way to do it, that the best way was to create a broth and a soup out of your meat ration. Now, it turns out that the equipment that the soldiers had, the kettles that they had, were perfect for this kind of meal. And possibly it was the best way to cook it. You could have your water, you could not lose any of the nutritious value, and also get a broth along with your meat portion and possibly cook other things at the same time. The most efficient way to cook, basically. How can we cook vegetables, our bread, and our meat all together in one dish? And we could certainly do that in our large kettles that the men were issued. This method is very, very simple. It works with both fresh provisions and with salt provisions. So you do have to change it up a little bit. If you have salt meat, you have to work that with a cold water first, and then you bring it up to heat with the meat in it. With the standard meat cut like this, which is fresh, we can just plop it into hot water, and that's fine. It's going to cook better. Now, we could make this be a little tastier and basically brown our meat first, but that's not a general direction that we get in the 18th century, and the soldiers, of course, wouldn't necessarily have the equipment to do both of these things at the same time. They might be able to basically brown their meat in an empty kettle and then add water to it and have, maybe the best flavor out of it, but generally these young soldiers are not going to go to that effort. I'm going to go ahead and put our meat chunks, which I've cut fairly small, right into our boiling water. And after they've boiled a little bit, I'm going to put a few of these very, very simple hard dumplings into the water also. Again, that's our bread ration that could cook right along with our meat. Here's our beef stew or soup, whatever you want to call it here. And I can tell, I can just feel it right here, that this meat is like as tough as it possibly could be. I can imagine the soldiers saying, oh, you want us to cook it like this, and it's the worst way of making this actually edible. Let's go ahead and try a piece here. Even though I've cut them rather small, I knew that this might not be the best way to do it. Okay, not that bad. Of course, we've got our dumplings here to eat along with it. We've got the whole broth to help fill us up. Yeah. This could work. This definitely could work. Frying meat was very popular in the time period, and of course, that's a very desirable flavor for some of these young soldiers. But it's not encouraged. In fact, the officers in the time period were trying to discourage this very thing. They issued orders, do not fry your meat. Of course, that's exactly what the men are going to do if that's the flavor they want. We even have an anecdote from a soldier in the time period where he talks about purchasing a small frying pan just for such a case as this. We're going to cut our meat into pretty small pieces. Again, this can be a very tough cut, and most of the cuts they were working with were not great cuts of meat. So we're going to cut it rather small so it's easy to chew up and put it in our frying pan. And maybe more than likely, their piece of meat had some fat to it, so they were able to fry things up in their pan. Our fried beef here in the pan, it's cooled off enough we can try it. This one smelled great as it was cooking. It even turned out nice and tender for this particular cooking method, which I am surprised. Maybe one of the tastiest ways to cook it, if you have the equipment, which many of the soldiers didn't. Reading all the accounts, the journals, the diaries, the memoirs, we know that a soldier's life in the 18th century was amazingly difficult. We can read about the rations that they were getting, a pound of bread, a pound of meat. That actually sounds entirely adequate today, right? So if somebody was going to feed us today, they said, this is what you're going to have, we wouldn't complain about that. But of course, the realities are so much more different in the time period. The equipment they had to work with, the conditions they were working under, and the difficult work that they were doing each and every day. They had to eat basically the same thing for a year or two at a time. There's no change in diet. There's no difference. It's the same meat. It's the same bread if they're lucky enough to get it. The challenges are amazing. We can try these out today and we can be completely satisfied. But we have to imagine what it was truly like for them to live back then.